Let's see. Fuck. Are you working? Are you working?
I think it's yeah, we're live.
Yeah. This is going. Okay.
I just wasn't looking on the screen because I'm still sharing this into some other places. So
okay.
Hello to anyone who's hopped in so far. Hello.
Yeah, I'll do that too. All right.
I worry that someone who was proactive 3 hours ago who clicked remind me is now waiting for a reminder for the one that's not going live. So
yeah. Fuck.
We'll know when Kali gets in here that we got it.
Okay. Let's
Joe,
see.
I'm just that person is always hopping in. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm gonna.
Oh wait, okay. So now I'm in the wrong pop-up chat. So everyone, thanks for bearing with us. So where do I find the pop-out chat for the? Oh, I guess okay. Wait,
wait. I am not the person to be given the.
You know what I'm talking about by the pop-out chat?
Not really. The like the just using the chat for the live stream, or
yeah, but the one that other people can see. Because you can separate it from the video. Okay, so if you click on the link that you just shared.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Pop out chat.
Yeah, it's nice.
Gotcha.
You can close that window and it doesn't create the.
Oh, this is great. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Thank you for this.
Yeah. It took a while to figure that out because I used to always kind of have the second video going, which is really distracting.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, this is a game changer. Holy shit.
You know what's really crazy? Okay, so I heard, and I think that this was something like, I don't know, Destiny and Hassan or someone like that talking recently. Actually, I think it might have been Kalinsky and Hassan or Destiny. I don't know. I watched a bunch of their videos recently, and in watching all of that, somewhere someone was saying they think with OBS, with for anyone who doesn't know, that's open broadcasting software. That with that you can set up multiple streams to different platforms all through the same. So like right now we could be on Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Like, you know what I mean? That how to centralize the chat, that would be another thing. Probably there's not, I don't know if there's the software for that yet, but to centralize the chat would be fucking awesome.
That'd be amazing. Yeah, I also I really want to learn OBS so I could do I really want to do videos or live streams where I just have someone on, like pull up a shitty video and we can rip apart some alt-right person on the thing. But yeah, eventually that'll happen.
Yeah, it's actually kind of, so for the left, okay, so I guess I'll just, I was about to say for the left tube adjacents, but I kind of consider myself a left tube adjacent, but in a different way. So like there's left tube, and then there's kind of like different kinds of adjacency. And one of those forms of adjacency is what I would call the Twitch streamers, which is like Vosh and Destiny and Hassan Piker. And these guys are like all, like they just go into the belly of the beast and they debate alt-righters all the time. And they spend a lot of time making fun, But the thing, it's just kind of weird because it's like you and I put all of this work into editing these short video essays, and they just fucking shoot they just shoot shit for like 2 hours, and they don't edit it at all, and then everyone it just works for them. Different demographic,
No, I know. My friend, I did a live stream with him. He has a channel called Fade to Brown. His name's Amish, and he's always talking about how I'll make like a video or start working on something with him. He's like, dude, what the fuck? Why do we have to do all this work? We need to get like an editor or something, or we need some way of like automating it. And yeah, it's so brutal just spending like hours and hours just trying to get like the lighting right or the editing on a video, and then someone can just talk out of their ass for like 2 hours and kill it, but it's just
and they're not even doing eye contact. You're not even sure if they have like bullet pointed notes. It's just like It just seems like Vosh is literally like half the time just like fuck these people, and it's like it's entertaining and it's totally entertaining, and like that like the main demographic who's watching this is probably people who are at the same time playing video games, so it's like kind of just like on the side. So
yeah,
what's up, Brett?
yeah. How's it going, Brett? Fuck yeah.
Reese.
So
oh, sorry. What?
So also I should say, did not do a good job of doing all my homework for this. I'm very sorry. I'm not good at this.
Do you go by Black Note or do you have a first name you go by?
Oh, I go by Sam. What about you?
I go by Dave or Theory, and
Okay.
I prefer they them pronouns. Actually, I'm also trying to get out of the habit of saying I prefer. I would rather just say I use or yeah, or those are the most accurate for me. So, what about you?
Yeah, I go by he, him pronouns, and I've been trying to get more into the habit of doing a check-in with everyone about like preferred pronouns and also introducing themselves and everything.
I always forget, but so you just Dave or Theory, and you're Sam. Okay, so I was gonna say Sam. Don't worry about it. I read so for those who are just like checking in, we talked about maybe having. I said like we could shoot the shit and maybe talk some theory, and then like 3 other times, Sam's like, "Oh, cool, we can talk about Jameson," and I was like, "I still haven't read Jameson." And then you were like, "Well, I've got a short excerpt," and I was like, "Well, if I'm going to do a short excerpt, like, do you want to like check out something I've been reading?" Because I had a couple of relatively short essays by Murray Bookchin, and I've been really interested in Bookchin recently because I've been interested in sort of post-anarchist, post-Marxist theory. When I say that, I mean people who kind of came into Marxist or anarchist theory, one or the other or both, and then have kind of like, for whatever reasons, realized that there's all these sort of imminent critiques, moved on past those, and they're working on in new ways. And so I'm interested in that, and Bookchin seemed like a really good place to go for that. So the 2 essays, one was called "Listen, Marxist," and the other one was called "The Communalist Project." And so I can talk about why those matter or are interesting to me. But are you saying you didn't read either of them?
I started Listen Marxists and then also did a skim through the essay, the Jameson excerpt that I sent you. Jameson, I guess I can go through a bit why I'm a big Jameson guy. I came into sort of like Marxist theory through, I basically studied like postmodern neo-Marxism when I was in university, so like critical theory and sociology. And Jameson I really like because he sort of melded sort of the worlds of like English lit stuff and sociology. But yeah, Jameson's...
That was where he lost me, was with all of the art history and architecture and literary criticism stuff, which is so typical of especially postmodern, theorists. Like they're almost always like drawing on those kinds of things. And I'm like, I'm way too uneducated in those areas.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe I can fill in a bit of those blanks. I am still pretty rusty on Jameson. Basically, the book that I'm the most familiar with of his is called The Political Unconscious, which is sort of where he puts out his big like structuralist argument that he runs with, which is essentially like a structuralist cause to historicize art and to look at it through, which he, I think, pretty effectively argues the most effective historical lens is Marxism, because it sort of has that dialectical element where it can include almost any other historical perspective while still remaining as like a viable superstructure around it. And so he sort of historicizes art. He has an interesting, he uses Althusser's concept of expressive causality. So the idea that any piece of a whole contains within it the totality of the whole of which it is a part. So in that way, any piece of art can be understood as, or containing within it the totality of the mode of production under which it's produced.
Well, just to make sense of that for everybody, like really quick,
Mhm.
I would say, so what does that mean if to have the whole inside of the part? It means that a week after the Bolshevik Revolution, everybody still showed up to work
Yeah.
because things still have to operate. And so the entirety of the social system that had just been overthrown was then reproduced only under a more authoritarian structure than before.
Yeah, basically.
And then you had all of these people who knew what should be happening, but were seeing that it was not happening, go, oh shit. And basically you've got a bunch of wannabe mechanics who've never built an engine. They've only read about engines trying to fix an engine while on the highway going 70 miles an hour.
Yeah, more or less.
With people shooting at them.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. Yeah, the book that the excerpt that I gave you is from Jameson's other book, which is it's been a heavily sort of memed book. It's called Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. So in which Jameson sees it I think sort of applies, at least in parts, more to postmodern art, and he specifically uses architecture, which I think is an interesting move because he sort of makes a case about how architecture is the most tied to capital of any art form. And for some, at one point in that book, I don't know if it's in that excerpt, I'm sorry, he talks about the Toronto Eaton Center, which I live in Toronto, and I think there's better examples of like postmodern architecture, so that was weird. But yeah, it's a interesting way of viewing sort of late capitalist society. And it's sort of a way I kind of come at a lot of the types of like critiques you'll hear from the right, where it's sort of saying something along the lines of like, oh, everything is degrading because our morals are degrading. It's like, do you think our like this vague ethereal idea of collective cultural morality has more to do with society, or like someone like a Derrida has more to do with society than something like 9/11 or the internet or globalized capitalism?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's some. Yeah, and actually, well, about the architecture thing. This was interesting because I'm used to hearing people talk about different postmodernism in different fields as kind of being not they're different, right? Like
Mhm.
and talking about them differently. Like postmodern art is different than postmodern theory, and here was Jameson basically being no, they're all kind of held together by the same thing. And I think it's that Marxian basis that allows him to do that, because he's like, these things did not come up in isolation. They all come up within the overall frame of what he's calling multinationalism, or
Mhm.
just like it's the new stage. He's calling it the postmodern stage of capitalism,
Mhm. Um,
which is how would you characterize the postmodern phase of capitalism? He seems to think that there are three main phases of capitalism. I think we're in the fourth stage right now, and I'm not sure if he talks about the fourth stage or if that's kind of like an arbitrary theoretical decision that gets made differently by different theorists. I don't know.
Um, I mean, I am sorry. I am like probably more rusty than you might be with this right now,
I
and
know I did
I
say
do
it.
really apologize with that. Yeah. I could be getting the phrase wrong here. I think he generally characterizes the postmodern capitalism as characterized by the hysterical sublime. Am I getting that right?
He didn't talk about the. Oh
Oh,
wait, did he talk about it in this one?
oh, fuck. I'm
Here,
sorry.
word, word searching hysterical. Yeah, it's not here.
Oh, damn. Okay. Or
No, I'm sure it's in the other book you read.
oh fuck, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, well, okay, this is maybe an interesting thing that I can shed light on, if not the part that I gave you. But yeah, he sort of has this idea of the sublime, the classical image of the sublime is you've probably seen that like painting that's like the man in a suit at the top of a mountain looking out onto like a sea of clouds and mountains popping up.
Isn't it
Um,
Nietzsche? Or it looks like Nietzsche, or it gets treated as though it's Nietzsche.
I mean, kind of, yeah. It's I don't think it's supposed to be Nietzsche, but it definitely makes sense to like put
Okay.
those two together. But
Okay.
yeah, that the classic idea of the sublime is sort of this idea of the mountain like peeking out into clouds, where it's you have this thing that is beyond the human scope of being able to understand it or to conceptualize all of it or catch it all in one glimpse. And so the idea is to sort of conquer that by this creation of the idea of like something that goes beyond the scope of our understanding. It's sort of this idea of like creating almost infinity, and in doing so and conceptualizing that and abstracting it is sort of this, it's portrayed often as this like very masculine intellectual ideal of like conquering it. And for Jameson, he argues that under postmodern capitalism, we now have this hysterical sublime, this this sublimity of messages and meanings and contradictory messages and meanings all at once. That and that is our new sublime reality. That is much more difficult and not really possible to abstract and conceptualize in the same way as like a mountain would be. The way I always describe it is like if you've read like Watchmen, like the new sublime is like Ozymandias looking at a million TV screens at once.
Right. And is this why he's talking about mapping?
Yeah.
So he also talks about the classic work, The Image of the City by Kevin Lynch.
Oh,
Do you remember?
no, I don't.
Okay, well, that's all right. So
Yeah.
basically, this is a book about the city and alienation in the increasingly urbanized city, which is actually a really cool connection to Bookchin that we can get to later, because he makes the distinction between the city and urbanization. Urbanization is this loss of sense of place, loss of sense of purpose or meaning in a collective, and that's urbanization. Whereas like a real city, a civil city, like it's going to have a more of a rooted or grounded sort of sense. So that there's like this alienation in the city that Kevin Lynch talks about, that Jameson's going to use, where he's like basically saying that Lynch nails it in his analysis, but that the analysis isn't taken to the rest of society. It's just the city. And for Jameson, obviously, because capitalism is a global phenomenon, this applies to like all aspects of our lives, not just the city. But the basic idea is that the monuments, nodes, natural boundaries, and built perspectives of the city, the traditional markers, have all become blurred or completely lost, to where you have a basic sense like where you are and where you work and maybe your social circles, but that you are increasingly alienated from a sense of the whole, or from a sense of place within the context of the whole.
Right.
And that I would say that is like the best definition of postmodernism. I said in the chat that we can also talk about the difference between the colloquial and the academic senses of these words. And I think that like that description of like a sort of alienated lostness from the traditional coordinates of life, that's kind of the thing that holds together both the everyday way of talking about postmodernism, even to like people like Jordan Peterson, and then like the academic way that people would talk about it.
Yeah, true. So
Except that we will see, though, that for Jameson, there's a huge difference between postmodernism and what Peterson's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, sorry. Can you sort of like fill me in on where Bookchin comes in more into yeah, his sort of his critique of Marxists, or
Yeah,
how you see that coming in?
I've got quotes. I'm not going to sit here and read them all
You're
off.
so much more prepared than me. I'm so sorry.
No, it's cool. I just finished my thesis in my master's, so I'm actually like, if you think about it, like I've just been doing this. So incredible. There's one big connection between the two readings, and that is that they both talk about outdated language. And I think that this is one of the huge differences between Jameson and some conservative like Peterson's conception of postmodernism, is that Jameson sees it as like two parts. It's not just that there is the loss of those traditional coordinates. There's also the fact that those traditional coordinates are useless to us now.
Mm-hmm.
They cannot be implemented to make sense of our present or to move forward into a meaningful future. And for Peterson, like, those coordinates need to be brought back.
Mm-hmm.
And for Jameson, he sees this all as a process, and he thinks that like he says at the very end, it's like the last sentence, that a postmodern politics, he says, the political form of postmodernism, if there ever is any, will have as its vocation the invention and projection of a global cognitive mapping on a social as well as a spatial scale. Basically, what that's saying is that we've lost traditional coordinates for people to make sense of themselves and their world, but that if there is going to be a political form of postmodernism, it would be a way for people to make sense of their current position and moving towards the future within the new context of the world, within the current material conditions that we're in now.
Mm-hmm.
And something that Jameson and Bookchin, going back to Bookchin, are both saying in these two pieces, the Listen Marxists and the postmodern the Frederick Jameson piece, is that they're both saying that Marxism is a theoretical language that was developed for making, or a way of cognitive mapping that was developed for making sense of a very particular set of historical conditions that are extremely different now. And that for that reason, traditional Marxists, orthodox Marxists, Marxist-Leninists, Marxist-Leninist Maoists, etc., are, they're basically saying they're LARPing. And now the thing, it's like you're just in a fantasy world. You're in a fantasy world where you think that there is a majority of people called the proletariat who work in factories still, and there's not. And something that they're both talking about, but Bookchin talks a lot more about, is how class stratification is a lot more complex and has become a lot more complex than Marx could have possibly seen, and also that the state and the market and the way they have been working together have been able to ameliorate a lot of, or at least kind of counterbalance a lot of the contradictions that Marx talked about, and not in a way that makes class warfare go away, and not in a way that makes the fundamental oppression of capitalism go away, but in a way that makes it so that the revolutionary potential of the proletariat is essentially obsolete, that the proletariat can no longer be the only solution. For Marx, it was pretty cut and dry. There was like, there's like these owners of the means of production, and they're an extreme minority. And then it looks like there's a growing population called the proletariat. And because of the discipline of the factory system, and because of they're basically all kind of put on this equal playing field, that they would all be able to find that solidarity. And because there's basically, they're all being completely fucked, that they would rally together and overthrow the system. But it wasn't supposed to come from Russia or China. It was supposed to come from developed countries. And because it came from underdeveloped countries that had to basically, they had to do they had to rush to try to catch up with industrialized society. The developed countries did all of these adaptive moves, with the welfare state, the New Deal, and in doing so, also with trade unionism and giving trade unions, more leeway, they were able to undermine the revolutionary potential of the proletariat. And now the proletariat, and that's the other thing that Bookchin said, is that the proletariat was always a minority. It was supposed to become a majority. Marx thought it would, just as a natural kind of growth of capitalism, but that instead we've seen the proletariat's not a majority, and instead we have like this. There's just more and more and more categories for people, not just in work, but in all ways of life, to be categorized, and that as those become infinitely more complex, this is something Baudrillard talks a lot more about.
Mm,
Maybe Jameson also talks about it. But people develop, or in Peter Coffin's sense, cultivate their identities on the
mm,
basis of where they are in these categorizations,
mm.
and that undermines their ability to get together in some
Yeah. I
simple
mean,
solidarity that could overthrow the thing.
I mean, yeah, a big part of that comes from, I think, the like big expansion, I guess, of like the managerial class and how that is like simultaneously sort of proletarianized in how like an example is I know so in Toronto, I don't know if this company is like bigger or is outside of Toronto really that much or outside Canada. Have you ever heard of Foodora?
No.
It's basically like another Uber, like it's like food delivery type company, and they're currently trying to unionize in Toronto, which is really cool because it's like it's a one of the first that I know of like gig economy type jobs that's like pushing to unionize. But um, one of the issues that they've been having, or I guess hopefully trying to overcome now, is starting to work with like coding and like developers on the back end who are also being like brutally exploited, but at the same time working almost opposed to each other in how those types of apps will sort of use a lot of like will sort of gamify work and use like a bunch of like psychological principles. I've done Uber Eats deliveries before, and there's all these types of ways that the app really encourages you to avoid logging off, avoid signing out. Like, oh, you've like reached your like extra, you'll get like a bonus point if you finish this round of things or whatever. And it's interesting how they these two classes, which essentially are both being like brutally like fucked over, the like the developers in many cases are absolutely not being like treated well, but at the same time them doing their job is exactly counter to the people on the like on bikes doing theirs, or I guess
Totally.
yeah, or maybe not doing their jobs, but it is counter to them unionizing or organizing.
Well, and especially when we talk about programmers, it allows us to talk about another thing that Marx did not foresee. And I didn't read this in books, and this was more of just like my own realization while learning the Adobe suite. And that's that um, work was being increasingly fragmented into mundane tasks, and it was stupefying. You know what I mean? Like people hated it. The drudgery
Mm,
of the most routine forms of work, but those have been increasingly replaced now, in this phase of capitalism by needing to know more and more and more and more jobs all at once. So, for instance, the person who used to have to know After Effects used to be different than the person who you needed to know Premiere.
mm-hmm,
And now now you're expected to know both, and you should also know Photoshop and Lightroom and all the rest. And so in the freelance world, where you're a precarious worker who has to compete as an individual, with like no protections, you have to like learn more and more and more skills, which is the opposite of the board factory worker.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting comparison because yeah, like that reminds me a lot of do you know like the Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft are like these two concepts. I always mix up which is which,
Are
but
those German words?
yeah. But one, it refers to sort of like a close knit, sort of simple society where like sort of everyone knows each other, and then one is sort of like the modern factory type thing. And the thing that characterizes their differences is a complex versus a simple division of labor, where the one that's like much more fragmented is characterized by an assembly line where everyone does one mind-numbingly boring simple task over and over again. And so yeah, it is really interesting how we've sort of come full circle to the point where everyone is expected to have these yeah, to know every single step and to have a million different jobs. But at the same time, it's so fully fragmented where in the case of like Premiere, yeah, it's like you're expected to know every part of a thing. Or in another sense, there's sort of like the gig economy world where, yeah, like you're expected to have like 5 different side hustles, which are really incongruous. There's no, like commonality between I'm, a cook, I'm a stand-up comedian, I do YouTube, I make like t-shirts that I put up on Redbubble, and like all these are very, very different skills that I like sort of a generalized knowledge and ability, but at the same time, it doesn't actually translate into any community or into any sort of lend itself to any group. It's almost like, I guess expecting to take up very many different, extremely complex divisions of labor, but into very different directions.
Those complex forms of labor, and the knowledge that's necessary for them are something that a person can rightfully take pride in, because it's like you've put a ton of effort into something. Now you've gotten really good at it. Now you're really useful, not just to this company, but you could help out like your family if like they needed this thing or whatever. And it's that taking pride in complex skill sets that further fragments the potential for that kind of solidarity, because it's like, no, your time energy is literally worth a lot more than a burger flipper, in the sense that if you showed up and there was like some grassroots activism going on, everyone wants you because you've got something like really useful that otherwise they have to pay someone a lot of money for. And so it's a sort of qualitative difference that's instantly there that wasn't there in such obvious ways for organizing during industrial capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, basically what we're getting at, for those who kind of just jumped into the chat, is we're talking about Murray Bookchin and Frederick Jameson, and we're talking about postmodern Marxism, the idea that like basically we live in an increasingly complex society. It's more complex than Marx was able to either predict, and it doesn't really matter. Of course, he's not a prophet or a religious person. Like he was analyzing the world as he knew it then, and the world is in the way that it is now. I was going to add that, just talking about the gig economy, I just finished reading. It's a really short book by Nick Cernicek. He's one of the authors of Inventing the Future. That book that says
cool.
Demand Full Automation, Demand Basic Income, Invent the Future, or whatever.
Cool.
Yeah, he's an accelerationist. I don't know too much. I'm not super plugged into that whole, strain of thought. But I just read Platform Capitalism because I saw the debate, or sort of argument, between Radiant2Pi and Peter Coffin, where Radiant2Pi did a YouTube video like 2 or 3 weeks ago that was a response to some tweets that they did back and forth. Basically, disagreements about what commodities are and what labor is in this stage of capitalism. And I was trying to get a better sense, like, what are the material conditions of the stage of capitalism? Because I'm used to hearing theorists talk about it, but Nick Cernicek uses a lot of awesome reference material for. He's giving stats on the ways that Google and Uber and these kinds of platform capitalist companies developed, and he talks about like the 5 different kinds of platform capitalist companies, which I couldn't recite all of those off the top of my head. I think I want to do a video about it eventually, but
yeah, it sounds really interesting.
I'll just use one example of how capitalism is really different in this stage than how it was right before the gig boom, which is that the new business model is growth before profit, and that was not the primary thing in any of the previous stages of capitalism. Growth before profit means that Facebook or Google are going to, as a part of their business plan, take a loss by giving away basically free services for decades, in order to gain the monopolies that they're trying to get. And but the thing is that because that's the business model, it's really easy to see that we're a short time away from radical change in our life worlds. where we're essentially living in a golden boom of the internet right now, where these monopolies are just doing everything they can to give us the world to gain that monopoly. But once they actually have it, it's gonna suck, because we might see way more stark class divisions at that point, but just between the subscription services, the monthly subscription services that rich people are able to use versus everyone else who's watching reruns of Survivor. You know?
Jesus, that's so terrifying if this is as good as it gets.
Yeah. Yeah, no, seriously. And then like, you know, what are the ways forward from there, and collective struggle and some kind of you know, making a lot of these things into public utilities, like we should have already done with cable, like we should have already done with, you know, Wi-Fi in general,
Yeah.
Or phone companies for that matter, or, you know, something more like China, you know, because like the state always has a huge incentive to get its hands on as much recording data as possible, because the state, as a metaphysical entity, basically its goal is to always predict the future and expand and preempt any counterattack from any potential enemy, and the more, and knowledge is like its number one driver. So the state has a huge motive to get its hands on all of that. So I mean, it could even be social democrats who are like super, you know, awesome in every way, like, oh yeah, Bernie and AOC, who ultimately, you know, by making it a public utility, actually turn us into China. Like that's totally possible, because, and right now, you know, millions of people under surveillance who can't fly on airplanes because their neighbors, who are the it's like cancel culture has moved into neighborhoods in China, where you actually have people whose jobs it is to like patrol and make sure everyone else is like minding their P's and Q's. And if they're not, then like you lose social currency, like an episode from Black Mirror.
Yeah. There's an interesting paper I read about it's like a social network analysis theory paper, like social networks in terms of like not like Facebook, but in terms of like who you know and how like connected you are and stuff. And one of the things that they sort of found was in China, like with social capital sort of supplanted material capital, and just your connection to people in power, or in the case of like these sorts of like mass government surveillance, you're like, I mean, I think like I saw a video, I don't know how fully, I mean, it sounds like this is pretty accurate, where it's like basically your credit rating is determined by like how much alcohol you buy and like how healthy you are and stuff like that.
Oh my god. Oh my god. I want to read really quick what, okay, let's do a quick catch up on, there's a couple I haven't been able to get to. Nobody is by definition, it's a matter of circumstances. Oh, nobody's a class trade. Okay, so River Ransom said, by the way, hi River. So are app developers class traders? And then Dan's like, nobody is by definition, it's a matter of circumstances. People who only have so many options, bus factor, how many people can be hit by a bus before the project shuts down due to lack of skilled people? I would just say that Bookchin agrees with you, and that's a way that that some, you know, orthodox Marxists might feel a lot like LARPers, because they're going to be like, oh, this person's a class traitor because like they're making more than 40K a year or whatever. And it's just like, yeah, but they're probably in debt.
Yeah.
You know, like you have no way of like the middle class is not real anymore. You know, everyone's in debt. And so it's just like, are you going to hold it against somebody that they're trying to supply at least like a college education to their kids or whatever? It's so hard to really push that line. And Bookchin's saying that if there is going to be any sort of a radical transformation from a scarcity-based society into an abundance-based society, that it has to include actors from every one of the previous classes. And it's like, well, that seems obvious now, I think.
No, I mean, I think that that's such a I mean, for one thing, yeah, like my roommate, for example, in terms of like people make like I live in like a shithole like boarding house. My roommate is a fucking like lawyer who just like has to live in like as shitty an apartment as me because he's in like an insane amount of debt from law school. But yeah, no, I feel like that's a piece of like rhetoric I always see in like I feel like most of like the online like leftist circles I'm in are on Left Book, which is the worst place that you could ever be in like leftist circles. um, but just the number of like keyboard warriors I see being like, oh, the gruesome deaths I imagine for like the bourgeoisie every night to fall asleep, and it's like, no, I mean, yeah, it's not like they're like doing something great by like being a landlord or owning a business, but it's also like they're playing to the hand that they're playing the hand that they're dealt, and I feel like a more productive way of looking at these types of like revolutions is sort of being like something like something I always hear is something like well, business owners have to like take a lot of risk and like hard work when they start up a business, and it's like, yeah, that's kind of true often, and it's like that is something that could very much be made a lot easier by collectivizing labor and stuff instead of looking at it as just like, and you'll get the guillotine first, you know?
Yeah. Well, and that's the biggest thing is like you're essentially demonizing normies. That's really what that is. It's like demonizing normies and you want to kill them all. And it's like, listen, the moment you make your position, your radical position, if you succeed, then it becomes normal. It becomes a new normal. Then there'll be a bunch of new normies who are going to be like the quintessential bro jock dudes, and then the sorority chicks. Like they'll still exist. They'll be fucking communists.
Yeah.
And then you hate communism, like because you know at that level of analysis, you're basically just like, it is a hipster thing. You know, it's just like you're a liberal who decided that by talking about guillotines and putting, you know, you get the bullet first. Now you're more pure, you know.
Yeah.
And so, and the hardest part about a left book space is just that it's the realm of representation. Taking it back to Frederick Jameson, the representation is fundamentally flawed. A lot of postmodernism is critiquing how we take representation as reality, and how easily it skews consciousness and perception. And it's the realm of representation where, let's just say it's Facebook. Everything's set up in a way for that corporation to be benefiting from these social interactions that aren't actually social. It's just this. It's literally just the fucking spectacle.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no idea who these people are saying these things. And even if you knew them for 10 years, you don't know if you actually tried to organize, whether it was a trash cleanup on your street or along the river or an actual revolution, if they would show up. Or if they showed up, you don't know if they would just talk for 3 hours and then not show up the next time after problematizing everything and making all the people who actually want to get things done to leave. So the problem with online is like you have no way of like knowing how much of this is just talk with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
It's no different with us talking here either, right? Like, so.
No, yeah, that's yeah, absolutely. I'm also like, I'm so new to this is off topic a bit. I'm still so new to like full like online friendships and stuff, and this still like blows my mind. Oh, by the way, I mentioned this in another live stream I was in. I don't know if you like checked out before this. I thought I saw you IRL at a party in Toronto, and I went up to this like French person. They looked like pretty much like you from behind, and like they had like a cool like punk jean jackets that like anti-fascist but anti-social on like a patch. I was like, this could be them.
Did you tweet a picture of them?
Yeah.
You did, yeah. I forgot about that. I even responded to it because I was in the middle of something, but I did show it to my partner, and I was like, I was like, does that look like me?
Oh, does it not at all? I don't remember that well.
She was like, kinda.
Okay. But yeah, no, I fully like went up to them. I was just like, yeah, are you like theory plebe? And it was this like French person. They're just like, I do not know what you are talking about. It's like, oh, it's this like YouTuber I kind of like, and they're just like, oh, you feel like you just know these YouTube people, and like it's like, no, like I feel like there's like sort of like a mutual, we kind of like each other's channels and stuff. It just sounds like a parasocial relationship, and
the world is like uncannily small.
yeah.
And I would not be okay. You want to know how small the world is? There's another channel I'm a part of called the New Symbolization Project. Have you seen it? Do you know about it? Did you see the Richard Wolff video where he's responding to Peterson?
Oh yeah.
Because that was from the New Symbolization Project page.
Oh,
unless you saw the abbreviated version on my channel, but
I mean, I think I saw that it exists. I haven't watched it.
Okay, so the full length version is on the New Symbolization Project page, and that's an organization at Boise State, and where I just graduated. And we had on American Johnson and Faraday Speaks, Caleb Faraday Speaks, for a live stream conversation about like, online radicalization, the Pewdie pipeline, and leaving the alt-right. And when Faraday Speaks starts talking, like, the first thing that they brought up was that one of the big factors in how they left the alt-right was seeing a video by the King and Queen of Losers, which is a band that did a video called Why I Left the Left and Came Back. Did you ever see that video?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's my friend. She lives in Boise. Yeah. And that's how small the world is.
That's just like wild. What?
Yeah, and she was almost gonna be there for that conversation. She just had to work. So
that's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's yeah. I've still like. There's like a bunch of like Toronto YouTube channels who we now hang out a bit. But yeah, it's cool. It's cool to see there's like pockets everywhere of like
So you are in Toronto.
Yeah. Mexi, Thought Slime, and Step Back History are all here too.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
We do I think maybe every 3 months or so, meetups and stuff. That's how after my second video, I went to one of those meetups and then met those people and stuff. And yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And that's, isn't that also where Peterson is?
Yeah. I went to U of T, which is where he taught. I never had a class with him or anything. But I did also go to elementary, middle school, and high school with his 2 kids.
So the daughter with the all-state diet?
Yeah, I had a crush on her in high school.
No! Well, after that bikini shot she sent her dad, I don't blame you. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no.
I feel like that's a low blow. Whenever people go after it, I feel weird whenever people joke about it. So I just joked about it, so I'm going to point that out.
I mean, weird. Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much weirder stuff. I follow her on Instagram, and it is upsetting. She she only eats beef, and she has all these videos of her cooking, but she's not a good cook at all. It's all burnt to shit liver that she's yum, and it's so weird.
Only steak. He's like salt,
steak, water, steak, whiskey, and vodka.
Oh my god. No cider.
I'm doing a video about food next, so I'm I'm definitely going to include as much of her as I can, but I don't think it's really going to talk that much about that. But yeah.
Did you see the remix I did of? So I do remixes. I've only done 4 so far. 3 of them are on my own channel. One is for the New Symbolization Project channel, and I did one on Soy Boy versus Meat Daddy. Bomber Guy destroys Jordan Peterson's all meat diet.
Oh, I saw that was the thing. I didn't watch it though.
I just shared it in the chat. It's really stupid, but it's funny. So
hell yeah.
It was just weird how well something that that H Bomber guy was saying went with this thing
Mhm.
that Peterson was saying, and so it's basically just a mashup of those things.
Oh, I mean, yeah, that I could totally see that. Yeah, that stuff's like so wild. I know, like, uh, one of my friends, every like guy that she like when she was single, every guy that she like would meet on Tinder would just be like, "Oh, so you go to U of T? Have you had any classes with Jordan Peterson?" And like, oh, I'm like, I feel like kind of ground zero for it because for a long time, like I have a bunch of friends who really liked him before everything came out because for a while he was just the guy who he was the psychology professor who put all of his lectures on YouTube for free, and so everyone
Yep.
would just be like, "Oh, this is sick," and that got him a lot of like goodwill for a long time. But yeah,
And if you watch a lot of his earlier stuff, it seems mostly harmless, and it actually took me quite a while to really realize like how I disagree with him on a theoretical level, because I feel like especially on left book, I feel like it's really easy for people to dismiss him there. You get people like, let's see, um, Nathan J. Robinson from Current Affairs in his critique basically attacks the obscure language, and is, he's saying a lot of nothing, which actually I fundamentally disagree with as someone who reads theory. Like if you actually read those excerpts that Nathan J. Robinson is like talking shit about, it's like, okay, you just don't like the genre of writing. That
mm-hmm.
it is a legitimate genre though, so you can fuck off. Then there's like the critique of well, okay. Anyway, I'll just skip forward to say that it's like how he is selectively using Nietzsche and Jung and like three other people that he basically always draws upon. That is the issue, and it's basically that he is and Jung especially goes the route of mystification.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, of making things about ethereal forms. It's like Platonism. Instead of doing the thing that you do in critical theory, which is looking at, trying to make sure that you stay rooted in or are mapping material conditions. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just like he cares about alienation, and that's something I thought was cool when I was with the old lectures. It's like, yeah, alienation and all of this stuff like that matters, but it's like then you realize, yeah, it has no material basis what he's doing.
Yeah. So one thing with the Nietzsche, which maybe you can like shed more light on this. One of my favorite Nietzsche essays, or I think it's the only like standalone essay I've read of his, or no, actually I've done other ones, but he has the one on truth and lies in a non-moral sense. Have you read that one?
You're talking about Nietzsche?
Yeah.
Okay. And I hope I don't sound pretentious for saying Nietzsche. Both are right.
Yeah.
But no, I have not read that one.
It's a great one. It's the one I always like recommend to anyone who like wants to check him out. It's very, very, he has one of my favorite like turns of phrases that it's like such a Nietzsche like line where he says like we are all sleeping in dreams on the back of a tiger, like just as a way of saying like that's my new favorite pretentious way of saying there's no ethical consumption in global capitalism. But
except for eating the rich.
yeah. But he basically arguably was one of like the first people to do post-structuralism in that essay, where he sort of argues that that on like truth and lying in a non-moral sense for him refers to like the levels of abstraction we go through when like an external stimuli in the world interacts with our senses and then is abstracted by our brain to turn into like sense stimuli, and then is further abstracted by our thought process and then turned into language, then abstracted further when you hear someone else use language to you, and sort of argues essentially that that is all lies, and that we need to like, I forget how his conclusion goes. He finds some sort of middle ground between fully like just rejecting everything that we can know and sort of like he uses like some very like Nietzsche-y image of like dancing in the rain without an umbrella or something. But
Yeah.
it's such an interesting essay, and it's like one of I mean, I couldn't think of like a better introduction to post-structuralism, and yet that is exactly what like every Peterson thing is so adamantly opposed to.
Well, and that's why people rightfully, if they want to take him up on the grounds of critiquing postmodern neo-Marxist feminism, rather than respond to any of his accusations, it's better to just go after his only fucking source. His only fucking source, except for probably the John Birch Society, is the book by Hicks. Stephen Hicks wrote a book on postmodernism, and Cuck Philosophy is probably the most popular video that does a takedown of that. But if you were to do some more rarefied searching on YouTube, there's a few videos that take that stupid book down, and it's like, it's not an academic book. And it's just, I mean, okay, first of all, everyone can have their own Nietzsche, because Nietzsche has multiple phases. And so he becomes a really easy person to cherry pick. Like, I forget what the chief propagandist for Stalin. I think that there was like this period after Stalin dies where no. Let me correct that. I think that it was the chief propagandist for Stalin would use the words of Lenin for basically everything that they put out and said that they were going to do. But Lenin has his own distinct phases of his thought.
Right.
And so basically it allowed this person it was malleable. He could make Lenin say anything. And it kind of works the same way with Nietzsche, because he's a fragmented thinker who's always working up to the magnum opus that he never actually writes.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest tragedy with Nietzsche, is that he died before even, I mean, he just had a bunch of notes as to what the 4 volumes of The Will to Power would be. Then he never got to actually write it. And then if you buy the Will to Power now, it's basically just a bunch of notes that his sister put together.
Yeah, and she's the Nazi too.
She's the Nazi.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's also that book. I think it's a really great book, The Genealogy of Morality, but it's like such a political Rorschach test where you can see just so much of like, it's his thing about like the sort of like slave revolt and like like going from what is it, good and bad to good and evil, and yeah, it's I think a really, really fascinating, brilliant book, but so like you will take very different things away from it depending on where you're at politically.
Yeah, and I like to say that his critique of slave morality is one. So he uses Christians and socialists as his main examples, and it's basically a critique that basically any Christian or socialist worth their salt has contended with that criticism and then adapted their worldview. And that I honestly think that without contending with the idea of ressentiment or resentment, as both ways, well, you look stupid. And I basically did a video. I'm going to link it in the chat here, and it's a little talk that I gave at a university called "Peterson Just Doesn't Understand Nietzsche," and my main point is that he doesn't understand ressentiment, which is such a crucial concept for Nietzsche, and that by not understanding it, like, he just looks really stupid because he's constantly playing into it. And so for anyone who's not familiar with the idea of ressentiment, I like to explain it this way. Basically, people need to feel intellectually and morally okay, if not superior, right? So obviously, people who have superiority complexes and they need to be right morally or intellectually, but everyone needs to feel at least okay. And that's if you look at baby boomers with their attachment to their media sources that constantly give them the same worldview, and they get so triggered if they start getting stuff from outside of that. It's a good example of how people need to feel that security of being intellectually and morally like in an okay place, probably superior. And a big way it works is like, the us versus them narratives. And with ressentiment, basically it's cheap gains. It's cheap gains of a sense of intellectual or moral superiority without actually being better or actually being closer to the truth. That's really what it basically boils
Yeah.
down to, the genealogy of morals, except that for him, he's trying to show the historical basis for this. And so there's the master morality, which is like, it's all about excellence and strength and achievement and courage and brilliance and, whatever. And then that there's the response to that, which is like, the people who basically never could achieve that say, you know what, that's all actually bad. It's actually evil. And by not doing any of that, I'm actually good. So they don't actually have to do anything, and now they're good. And the thing is like, if you abstract the idea of ressentiment out of the genealogy of morals, it's useful for thinking about how people need these cheap senses of okayness or superiority, and how we're so easily seduced by people who come along and say, hey, you don't need to change anything. You're actually better than those people over there.
Totally.
Which is exactly what Peterson does. You're better off sitting on your ass at home and not doing anything with your life, as long as you're not trying to change the world, because those people are chaos.
Yeah. I want to sort of quickly. I feel like Peterson is a good way of getting into this. One of Jameson's structuralist, as is Peterson, and he comes out like he's fairly against like sort of like Marxist post-structuralism. And I feel like it'd be interesting to, speaking of someone who doesn't understand the difference between like Marxism and post-structuralism, to sort of get into that and get into those weeds a little bit. I mean, obviously, like there's like massive like I'm always so confused by why people are always like, oh, these like feminists don't think that there's anything that's like actually good or evil, or like these Marxists and stuff. It's like those are like like theories of morality that have very clear ideas of what is wrong and what is not wrong. Like I don't get at all where that comes from. And yeah,
it's evangelical Christianity is where that comes from. Because evangelical Christianity's the way that people like Ray Comfort work when they're trying to recruit, new religious people on the street or at universities, they say, do you know what's the difference between good and bad? And then they just push people on it until people and to get people to say, like, you can't just make this up. You can't just decide willy-nilly what's good and bad in a way that benefits you. There has to be an objective basis for good and bad. And then, without God, you can't have that.
Right.
And so they see any secular attempt to do ethics as, well, it's just make it what you want and rationalize it. And it's like, yeah, but that's literally what you're doing with God. Literally what you're doing with God. You just put God under your arbitrary preferences, and now you get it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that's actually exactly where it comes from. But yeah, I don't know. I wish I was still in the. I wish I wasn't so rusty on this stuff. But yeah, Jameson, as I recall, is like fairly opposed to I couldn't probably pick up like exactly where his argument is, but I believe he's like essentially on people like on like more post-structuralist thinkers. He sort of thinks like that's all like okay, but it sort of doesn't leave us with anywhere to go or with anywhere left to organize, or I think he sort of comes to the idea that post-structuralists, like deconstructing everything, comes to a bit of an ideological dead end.
Yeah. So you're saying Jameson holds that?
Yeah.
View. Which is, I mean, I would agree that well, okay. The first thing is with continental philosophy, especially, and we should probably start defining terms, talk about what structuralism is, as far as we both think it is. Post-structuralism, what is that? and then but even continental philosophy, which for those who don't know, basically continental philosophy is going to be like where you find Derrida, Foucault, Heidegger, Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Alain Badiou, Slavoj Žižek, Judith Butler, and analytic philosophy is like Bertrand Russell, and I don't think there's any other prominent analytic philosophers right now that would be names people know, but and they're fine with that because they don't care. Because analytic philosophers are not very sociable people in general. They just care about like dissecting like minute arguments that have huge implications, but usually they quarantine those problems away from social and political problems. Whereas, thinkers that when reading them sound like quantum soup, the reason they sound like that in the continental tradition is because they're usually dealing in like 8 disciplines at once, working in anthropology and sociology and economics and philosophy and stuff like that. And so that's the difference there. But where was I going with continental philosophy before I had to define it? I know. I totally. Yeah. Well, I think I've characterized the difference.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I can jump in and sort of do like my characterization of like post-structuralism and structuralism, and then you can jump in back. So yeah, I mean, my general way, I feel like it's easiest to sort of go, structuralism is, I think, is by definition easier to define, where it's essentially this sort of I would kind of say like modernisty way of like sort of philosophy, where it is based around I come at this way less from like philosophy and more from like critical theory, so I'm going to delve and use that language a bit more, but it sort of comes from, let's have this sort of like guiding meta-narrative sort of superstructure through which we can view a lot of different things. And so in the case of Jameson, it's use Marxism as a historical lens through which to use to use history as a method for reading texts or art, or I mean whatever type of text you want to use. Peterson, I would argue, is also very much a structuralist, where his view is much more like Jungian archetypes and stuff, but it's about impose this type of order and ideology over top of everything that you do your readings on, and through that you sort of get like I mean, I think that there are kind of obvious advantages in terms of how much like clarity you can get out of reading from that. That said, the post-structuralists kind of came in and were like, well, that's kind of bullshit though, and sort of we're like, no, let's just like deconstruct everything. And so you get this like in Derrida, you get like extreme like Derrida gets so much shit for being like incomprehensible, but I feel like it's not really deserved, in that he's thinking in such deep levels of abstraction, where he's deconstructing how we use language, what language is, like sort of what I was bringing up with Nietzsche. It's sort of saying, well, how are all of these things constructs, and sort of deconstruct and demolish all of these things that we previously held as givens. And
it's like Peterson, man. Like Peterson's just so smart. You have to have an IQ within at least 10 points of mind to understand him.
Yeah, exactly.
Except for real, though.
You have to be a real Rick and Morty fan to understand Jordan Peterson.
Exactly. So you reminded me of the point, and that's just that. Okay, well, first of all, your point is that if I'm hearing you right, that Derrida is working on this level and dealing with these problems, that is, it's just, he has to be, if you want to critique him, you have to critique him where he's actually working, and not just where, on his own terms almost. Right?
Yeah.
Because it's largely experimental what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I would say that. Or I mean, I think that it's just that, yeah, I think that he's often characterized as not making any sense, whereas I think that it's or that it's just like gibberish, and it's like no, it means something. You do have to like, yeah, give him that level of credit. That said, I do kind of not love like Derrida as a writer or thinker. Like I think it's very interesting and very cool. Uh, he has a essay called like about like I think difference, and it's a really interesting way where he's like dissecting the idea of a center and a periphery and how those two terms are rely on one another to exist, and neither is something without the other. And that's the type of thing that like a post-structuralist will sort of say, that like these two concepts, something for example like gender, male and female, are rely on one another to exist. Neither has a static definition that excludes being the opposite of the other.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, or something that comes along with that is the critique of essentialism. And if you're talking about
Yes.
you're talking about what the most central thing, entity, or idea in a complex text, or a society, which for post-structuralists, everything's a text, because everything kind of operates according to the rules of texts as they've developed their analysis. But if you're trying to talk about what the most central thing is, so let's just say for capitalism it would be capital, or let's just say for a book it's going to be the character. So Harry Potter is the center of Harry Potter is Harry Potter and the life journey of this character. Well, the problem is that if you're going to treat that like the center, like it's the essential center, and everything is like a periphery to that, you lose a strong sense for like how many other fundamental or essential like components there are, without which none of this stuff would be held together the way it actually is. And at the end of the day, you realize like that there's a lot of decisions that get made, whether consciously or not, about what becomes center in your analysis, that might have to do with your prejudices of your historical position. This is where you get post-colonial critiques of the Eurocentric way of viewing the first and third world, et cetera. My thing I was going to say earlier when I was talking about continental philosophy is, because I remembered, because you were talking about Derrida, and that's just that a lot of the time with continental philosophers, when people don't like the continental philosopher, what they really don't like are the continental philosopher's acolytes. And Derridians are obnoxious. They're fucking obnoxious. And I'm not talking about anyone in the chat. If you're a Derridian, I love you. But I'm talking about like these tenured professors at conferences that I've seen giving presentations where it's like they pointed out something problematic in the discourse and that's their presentation. And it was like something that seemed like a pretty obvious point that wasn't really, it's like, oh, well, nothing in the discourse either rides or dies on this thing you just problematized. So what the fuck are you talking about? And then they're like, you just want me to get essentialist. And it's like a cop out for them. And then they run away and they're like, I'm Derridian. And it's like, no, Derrida wouldn't have done that though. And one of the things that Derridians often do is like, you can tell that they did not really tarry with the text they're critiquing. They didn't really roll up their sleeves and get into it. Whereas Derrida does. If you read up grammatology, for instance, it's basically like 300 pages of critiquing like a 20-page essay by Rousseau. And 300-page critique of a 20-page essay that he must have read 100 times, and that he also went ahead and read everything else Rousseau had written at that point. So there's like this attitude that deconstruction is a sort of disrespectful, like not taking anything seriously, like fuck everything, way of approaching texts. But like if you actually see Derrida on the way he does it, it's like that's not true. But the other most annoying thing about continental philosophy students is that they act like their theorizing is always activism. And I am not going to say that theorizing can't be activism. I'm just going to say that using activist language or applying high theory to activism doesn't make you the most pure / radical person in the room. And so like, I don't know, like theory plebe, the word plebe is supposed to kind of like show that I'm not like, my theory doesn't give me some kind of like a higher status. I find use in these ideas. And part of that, like I want to be expressed about that is just because I feel like a lot of people get turned off to theory by these people who think like they're the most woke person who'll ever walk into a room just because they've been reading Derrida for 3 years or whatever.
Right. I mean, that's absolutely pretty spot on about a lot of um uh, people in in that. I've, for one thing, very strangely heard like Jameson be thrown in. I know someone who described I guess like the Derridians are talking about as the silly Marxists. Which
he got called that?
Yeah, he like lumped Jameson, which is very much not like, I mean, he's extremely opposed to that because like you were sort of bringing up about theory as activism, I feel like a part of Jameson's critique is along the lines of that while deconstruction can be very useful, and I think it does often lead to some very interesting discoveries or some interesting avenues to go down, it doesn't really lead to an actual it doesn't lead to a new like theory. It just sort of problematizes rather than create something on its own.
Right. Well, and that's the other thing is like a Foucauldian analysis of power relations in society is useless on its own. It doesn't have, he never teases out the normative his own normative qualifications for how he's going to judge legitimate versus illegitimate power relations, which is something you have to do if you're going to do political theorizing. And because he doesn't do that, it kind of just like, ooh, power, it's everywhere and it's bad. And it's just like everything's a prison. And that's why it's so memeable. And I don't think I think Foucault, for him, it was like a simple decision to not take on those questions because he was interested in like seeing things in a new way. But then you get the Foucauldians, and they pack in their own not necessarily too well fleshed out normative criteria for like what's good and bad or legitimate or not. And like for instance, maybe a really cheap anarchism where it's just like, you know, lifestyle marketing that essentially is just a middle finger towards anything that could possibly look like asymmetrical power relations, but they're a Foucauldian. It's like you've just dressed up like a 5-year-old's analysis of power relations with Foucault's language. That's what you've done.
Yeah. Yeah, and then just like the result is like that Adbusters brand shoe that they made or something.
Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's anywhere else we should go with this. I don't know. Should we check back in with the chat? I haven't really been paying attention. I'm seeing that you're. Yeah.
Everything is shaped as a center and periphery. Yeah, but part of the thing is, Dan, is like, what is the center? What is a periphery? Depends on what questions you're asking, and what frameworks you're implementing, and what perspective you're coming from in the analysis in the first place, right? And so like that's part of what post-structuralists do, going back to, so I guess we could go do a little bit more on post-structuralism versus structuralism, just to say like that one of the important distinctions to make is that post-structuralism isn't really an ism. It's a bunch of theorists who got disillusioned with the possibilities of structuralism. And this is typically, I think, after Althusser. I think Althusser is one of the last significant structuralists, except for obviously Jameson. But that doesn't mean that they're like ex-structuralists, like, or that they're anti-structuralists. They usually retain a lot of the insights of structuralism. And so, I mean, for instance, like if they're working in the critical theory tradition, then like they're still Marxist to some degree. But I just did an interview with Nancy Fraser, actually, like 2 parts of the 5-part interview are up on my channel now. And she's a huge critical theorist. I was like really honored to have her on. And asking her what critical theory is and why it helps us understand capitalism. Basically, her definition of that is non-dogmatic Marxism.
Wow.
That's basically just her definition, is non-dogmatic Marxism, which is a really interesting take. She teaches at the New School. So for those who've heard of the Frankfurt School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, no, I'm just kidding. The Frankfurt School was the first kind of. Sometimes when people are talking about critical theory, all they mean is the Frankfurt School, which is like Horkheimer and Adorno and a handful of other theorists, including Marcuse, and ending with Habermas. But other people talk about critical theory in a broader way that I think we're using, that would include Jameson, for instance. Mm-hmm. It includes American scholars. It includes French post-structuralists. And anyway, the non-dogmatic Marxism take is really interesting, coming from someone who's teaching at the New School, because the New School is the school that got set up when the Frankfurt School people had to flee Nazi Germany and set up shop in New York City.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's sick.
Yeah. But what is non-dogmatic Marxism? I would say it's an attempt at actual scientific socialism, but that if you want to have a scientific socialism, I'm touching on the distinction made by Engels in the short essay available on the Marxist archive called Socialism, Scientific, and Utopian. I think that's the name. Where basically there's always been the people who want to smoke pot, sit around and say, fuck the cops. And then they think that if everyone could just see their way, then we could have utopia now, and that all they have to do is keep being themselves and eventually we'll get there. That's like this is like I'm kind of like oversimplifying, but that's the utopian socialist. Whereas like the scientific socialist says, we need to understand how things work and what their actual possibilities for changing are. And then we have to use a scientific method, meaning constant experimentation, qualification, and adaptation moving forward. And post-structuralists are really well known for their critiquing science, or at least the sort of assumptions people have about science in a scientific culture. Because it gets overly simplistic. People think the truth is as simple as 2 + 2, when in reality we have quantum mechanics and calculus, and these things don't function anything like 2 + 2, right? And so scientific socialism is going to be critical of Marx and Engels and Lenin and Mao, and it's going to assume that they didn't fucking get this revealed from God, that their takes aren't necessarily the truth. But so what would it mean to be non-dogmatic in that tradition? It would mean being critical of these things and using the same kinds of tools, but trying to always be taking it to the new situation that we're in, because we're in a new situation.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I want to bring up a thing. Fuck, my computer's not good for this.
Opening multiple tabs.
I mean, I just loaded the a big book on a PDF, so it's probably not liking me for doing that. I maybe come back to that. One other thing I thought might be an interesting thing to go into a bit is sorry to be changing the subject that much, but
I think we've almost exhausted the subject we were on, so you're good.
One of the sort of things with the Jameson book is him sort of characterizing what late capitalism writ into culture it looks like, and he focuses a lot about architecture, but I think in literature and popular culture, it's really interesting, I think, what postmodernism, postmodern culture sort of expresses itself as. I think Jameson talks a bit about how it's sort of the low, like it's like allusions to airport books and pop songs and stuff on the rather than the way I sort of I look at this as sort of a pretty, like, you can draw a line from like modernism to postmodernism, where one of the like seminal modernist texts is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. And I don't know if you've read it, like the whole thing is so filled with just like allusion after allusion to like classical works, but the point of it is that they're all sort of in shambles. It's like a reference to Shakespeare, but it's like some drunk guy at a bar saying it, or like it'll be like some famous painting that's like shattered in the gutter or something. And like generally, what?
It's like the internet.
Oh yeah, exactly. And yeah, like sort of the idea of like T.S. Eliot is, and I think sort of can broadly be the like described as like what the problem that modernists are looking at is this sort of like loss in faith in like how valid like these like sort of like meta narratives are, and a dissatisfaction with them, and seeing them sort of like not matter anymore. And you know, for T.S. Eliot, it comes in the form of like, no one reads the Bible and Shakespeare anymore. It's like lame, but it like you can see like a lot of sort of modernist thinkers sort of dealing with that, whereas for postmodernists, it's like the book I would say is like the comparison is like Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49, which is super like allusion heavy. It's like a very small book, but it's all like allusions to like pop songs, or like it'll be like this like secret code, and it's just like fuck you spelt backwards or something. And I wonder what your thoughts are on how that seems like to be. I mean, you see it so much with the internet, how there's this, the new sort of convention is this reification of like very like low art or whatever into these sort of like big ideas, I guess. I don't know if I'm describing that well at all, but like whereas like before it would be like an allusion to Shakespeare, now it's like a minion or something. And right. I wonder sort of what your thoughts are on how I mean, we sort of went into how like the whole like theory isn't like revolutionary or whatever, but I feel like it's kind of an interesting question about how, if that is sort of like a democratization of popular culture or like high intellectual culture, or if that is more just emblematic of like a deep nihilism and sort of a giving up and fuck it, or if it's both, or if there's
Can you rephrase the question?
I don't know if I can.
I think I'm following. So the question of like low art and high art, and how low art functions now, and how no one cares about high art anymore, or if they do, they're like niche, is like something I've thought about. This is like when Pierre Bourdieu wrote Forms of Capitalism, where he makes a distinction between social and cultural capitalism not being the same or reducible to economic capital. One of the things that's interesting back then when he was writing is that it was actually a form of cultural capital to know your Plato, to know your Whitehead, to know your Kant, to know your Heidegger. In France, you couldn't be taken seriously if you didn't. Now here I am reading that, and it fucking isn't social or cultural capital for me to be knowing those things, because I'm not in Paris in the 70s, right? Or in the 40s, you know.
Yeah, like Marvel Cinematic Universe is like a much bigger like cultural cachet, or Game of Thrones or something.
Exactly. And that speaks volumes. And actually so I graduated, and I hadn't watched Endgame yet, and I haven't like watched a lot of movies in the last few years while I've been like primarily focusing on studying. Like,
I don't watch movies.
I watched like Game of Thrones and a couple of, The Good Place and things like that. But I didn't really keep up on a lot of stuff. And I was like, I want to see Endgame. And so like I went and I've watched like 5 or 6 Marvel movies that week. All of a sudden I could have like really interesting conversations with a handful of people who've been in my life the whole time, who I hadn't had a conversation that interesting with them in quite some time. And it's because they've been plugged into and keeping up with Marvel.
Mhm.
And it was like, oh wow, this is what it's like to have a little bit of cultural like capital to build social capital with, you know.
Mhm.
But I would, so with critical theory, especially with like the Frankfurt School, they talk about the culture industry, and they really didn't like this the popularization of low art. Basically, it's like art aimed at the lowest common denominator, which is kind of like how advertisements and movies are generally aimed at 15-year-old boys nowadays. It's
Mhm.
like what is it like to live in a society where basically everything, all of our money is going towards winning the attention spans of fucking 15-year-old boys. Like,
Yeah.
well, we kind of know because we live in that society, and it sucks. And obviously that's a bit oversimplistic. There's other dimensions that are also like, but
Mhm.
uh, the cultural prominence of Need for Speed and Transformers, and the fact that Marvel's been able to do what it's been able to do with its budget, etc., speaks volumes. So um, the, my thing's like, I'm not worried about like, oh, no one's reading Shakespeare, as much as like the cultural conditions for new Shakespeares to arise are fundamentally undermined by capitalism,
Right.
because there isn't the interest, attention, currency, monetary or attention, for those kinds of cultural products anymore.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that my time energy video that I just went up a couple weeks ago, like, which is sort of like a 4-page version of my thesis, is trying to get at is that um, grassroots organizing, community development, and in a sense of like knowing your neighbors and being an actively engaged citizen in your city, etc., or cultural production in the sense of producing,
Mhm.
always trying to produce great works, or at least uh, engage in great works, is all undermined by people not having surplus time energy in their weeks. Time energy being like just
Yeah.
it's the existential basis for having either time or energy. So under capitalism, we tend to have time without energy, or energy without time, and that's because we're wage laborers, basically.
Right. I mean, so I mean, I do definitely relate to that experience. That said, I do kind of take issue with the idea that like we won't have like another Shakespeare. I do think that like new Shakespeare won't look like old Shakespeare, but I mean, I think that this idea that like war and peace will never happen again, or like oh, like culture's in decline because no one reads War and Peace or something. It's like I don't know, like I'm like working my way through the Wind Up Bird Chronicle right now. I've tried reading Infinite Jest, and like I don't know, I feel like there are plenty of pieces of like that type of like I don't want to say David Foster Wallace is like Shakespeare, but I feel like there are like a lot of those like capital L literature, like capital A art pieces that
I'm
still
not saying there
happen
aren't
very
great
much.
works. I'm not saying there aren't great works. So I agree with you, but I'm saying that for a work to stand in the same um, sort of position of cultural recognition, to where it can actually hold together a society where we've all engaged it and we all have opinions about it, doesn't mean we all love it. Some of us
Right.
might hate it, but we've all engaged it. Like,
Yeah.
no, ain't nobody got time for that. Basically,
I
right?
mean, yeah.
So we're constantly being fragmented into subcategories, where it's like great works will still arise within those subcategories. But um, I mean, what I'm also talking about is not just the fault of capitalism; it's also just the fault of the internet.
Yeah, I mean, because that is a really interesting thing because, like, I mean, we were sort of talking about like there are things like Marvel's Cinematic Universe or Game of Thrones. By the way, by Brett, Brett's signing out because he's gonna go watch that right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I mean, that is really interesting because those are I would say, yeah, like arise materially differently from something like Shakespeare, and I wonder if that is pure, like if that's a matter of um also like just like the economics necessary to build something like that, just like the level of capital that's required to make something that now holds our attention, um or yeah, if it's possible for there to be just something that's like uh potentially like not necessarily like revolutionary but potentially separate from, I mean, have you ever seen, there's a really good documentary called This Movie Is Not Yet Rated. One of the things they get into is how movies that want to have like tanks and stuff get to use that for free from the US Army on the condition that the Army gets approval of the script. So like basically almost
Whoa.
yeah. So if you want to make like a military movie that isn't army propaganda, your like a budget has to go up by so much, which effectively would make it really difficult to also make not army propaganda.
Whoa. Yeah,
Um,
I knew that the Marvel movies and a lot of other movies like that get funding from the military, but I didn't know that.
yeah.
Which is just like such it's like the proof for what it's just like it's a concrete example of what Althusser is talking about in the ideological and state apparatuses like essay. Like there are these organs of the state that are made for reproducing ideology. There's these organs of the state that are meant for uh, reproducing the society itself through like repressive means like the
Mhm.
police and the military. Yeah. But like that each one contains a part of the other. So like there's no
Yeah.
like distinct difference, but like but that they work in tandem and that yeah, like the military being so central in making the movies is like crazy.
Hmm. I mean, yeah. So I guess I mean, I like this like tangent that we're going off on, but I guess sort of just to rephrase my question, not necessarily to derail this, but just so we can orient ourselves, maybe. But uh, so for something like Jameson's description of postmodernism, it was some like the types of like books or like things that are like I would like be like capital A art that I was like talking about. Or for instance, my friend Maya, who plays like the furries in all of my like video in the last two videos,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
her like she does like very like this is like capital A art. Like she like has like a bunch of like extremely like she's like in that like extremely pretentious performance art world. And I like from like the stuff I've seen from her, like her friends, and like the stuff that I like try and be like kind of plugged into. I feel like I couldn't really imagine like modern, just like out of like a matter of what the conventions are. I couldn't imagine like modern art that doesn't have like big references to like internet culture or at the very least like TV shows or things like that. And yeah, I feel like um Fuck, I'm not sure where I'm where I was gonna go with this. Um, I don't know. I guess there's sort of the two ways of looking at that is like at like looking at it as like this is like culture in decline. This is the destruction of sort of our culture because maybe or maybe it could be sort of potentially the optimistic way of looking at it is that now sort of the gatekeepers are gone. You don't need an English degree to know all the illusions. You need like an internet connection and to be like super on Twitter. And yeah, I don't know what that sort of like says about where art is now. And maybe it sort of factors into what we were talking about with like sort of art that sort of holds society together, where now art, the touchstone is just the super everything internet, which isn't really a culture, but a phenomenon that's happening to us. I don't, this is not a question. I'm bad at
Yeah,
asking
I was
questions,
like
but
I was not sure if like
um,
out a
I don't know
question.
where that goes at all.
Yeah, as long as I
Uh,
don't have to tease out a question from it, then I can just riff off of it, right? So,
yeah.
um, I guess I don't want to sound just like an old fogey who's like Shakespeare's never going to come back or something. I don't give a shit. But part of the reason being I never really read Shakespeare, so I guess I don't know what I'm missing. I've read Macbeth. What can I
Yeah,
say?
same
But
here.
I've seen Macbeth, and I read it
Yeah.
because I was going to see it. And besides that, I've not read any. But yeah, I don't know. My hope is that we'll have. Well, I'll just say this. I guess I would just say for sure that it sucks, and that we that as human beings on a planet who have to live together and who like storytelling and art as ways of finding meaning in life in general goes, we should condemn the tendency of capitalism to appeal to the shortest attention span in the room, and particularly ones that just want to see big boobs and explosions. So like that's just like that's not appealing to the higher possibilities of human potential
Mhm.
or experience. But with that said, I think that the internet's fucking awesome, and I'm kind of a fan of the disintegration of culture that we live inside of. Um, and that I think it's giving rise to new forms of culture, and that I don't see it as a society in decline. I think that if someone like Peterson or Christina Hoff Sommers, who's going to like bemoan the loss of the arts or whatever, if they're serious, then they just have to be anti-capitalist. If they're
Mhm.
serious, then they have to be for uh, securing the conditions for a post-work society. Not
Mhm.
necessarily, and when I say post, it's like saying post-structuralist. It's not anti-work, it's not non-work, but it's just like a society that is more based around leisure as that being the fundamental shared value, because we can't make things and share them with one another and truly enjoy them without them being cheap throwaway commodities in a society that's based around profit instead of leisure. We literally can't.
Mhm.
So there's but human beings are meaning making machines, and we're still gonna like have a lot of fun online. Hopefully, if Google doesn't ruin everything. But
Yeah. Have you ever read Marshall Berman?
no,
He has a book called "All That Is Solid Melts into Air." It's a quote of Marx, but
yeah,
it's one of like sort of his like thesis is that he believes that like we've never left modernism, but that the uh, like the key characteristic of it is the he describes it as like we are in a maelstrom between the utopian possibilities and nightmarish realities of what capitalism and like modernity is and looks like. I mean, I feel like that kind of adequately describes like sort of what you're talking about in terms of the entertainment and like the possibilities for the sort of disintegration into this massive awesome like weird internetness and the realities of just the most lowest common denominator stuff rising to the top or being pushed on us. And yeah.
just one of the issues with what you just described as well is that human beings ultimately, like, to really get a lot from a cultural product, have to really dive in to it,
Mm-hmm.
take it down to its roots. So even when not everybody was a lot fewer people were Christian than we typically think when we think about the original European settlers coming over to the to the Americas. But they were like 98 to 97% literate, if we are to believe the sources Neil Postman uses in the
Mm-hmm.
books that he wrote. Um, and the difference between 98 and 97 there is like male to female. So like the literacy levels were high for both males and females. And everyone had a King James Bible. Um,
Yeah, Bible and Shakespeare, and I think there's another one too.
Probably Plato or something like that. But
Mhm.
like, and there was a value, people valued it, and
Mhm.
people and books were written to be read and reread and reread and reread.
Mhm.
And there's if you've never reread a book that was written with the intention of being reread, then you don't know what kind of an experience that is. It's one of the best experiences ever. And that's one of the things that's so frustrating about continental philosophers is that they write to be reread. I think it was Aristotle or Hegel, I forget which, says that you have to read a book 3 times. The first time just for the initial orientation of the content, the second time to truly understand the content, and the third time to compare it to everything you already knew. But it's just like that just sounds so overwhelming nowadays, right?
Yeah, totally.
So how was I tying that into whatever you were talking about? I don't know.
No, I mean, yeah. I think we're past the point of like making arguments or asking questions with each other. Yeah, no. Yeah, I think that's you're absolutely right with um, yeah, the way that that culture is sort of I guess yeah, like declined in that way where we have this
Oh,
sort of like throwaway. Yeah, go ahead.
you reminded me. So you said when popular culture is appealing to the lowest common denominator. The thing is like that's gonna be like pop music or pop movies that are like
Mm,
blockbusters or whatever. But because those fundamentally can't satisfy the
mhm.
yearning of the human soul, speaking metaphorically,
Yeah.
um, because those can't, because they're kind of meant to be seen, consumed, thrown away. Um, we have the cultivation of consumer identity works even better, because of this kind
Ooh.
of fragmentation, because we define ourselves in differentiation from one another, and that in a
Yeah.
world where there's kind of like a mainstream music and movies and stuff like that, throwaway books. There's also a lot of stuff that's really great, but that creates lots of small pockets, and the that when you really dug deep into a pocket, let's just say that like you get into Judaism, and you're reading the Torah, and you're getting more and more and more and more out of it. It's like,
Or other subcultures.
no, that immediately came to mind because
Okay.
I was one of my friends on Instagram has been posting a lot of stuff because he's been doing that. And he's getting a lot out of it, and it's just like all out of left
Hmm.
field because I don't know anything about it. I was raised in a Christian family that thought that it was the natural inheritor of the project or whatever.
Oh
Obviously,
wow.
which is obviously bullshit.
By the way, I just want to
But
say real quick, from someone Canadian, America seems terrifying. Like you're like how quick you were with like the evangelical thing. Also, like I was like, oh, we don't really have that to the same extent. We're like starting to now, and it's awful. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
I don't know. My worst evangelical uncle lives in Canada, so I don't know. But
I mean, it's also probably I live in Toronto and was born here thing too, so that's definitely a huge part.
yeah, go to rural Alberta and
Oh
tell
yeah,
me.
that's a thing.
But what was I saying? Uh,
Like
okay.
going through the
What I'm saying
Bible
though,
and
that's like every genuinely like religious tradition. You can go deeper and deeper and deeper and keep getting more and more and more out of the experience. But the further you go, the more alien it makes you to people in other subcultures or religions who are doing the same things in theirs. Unless you're the type of person who has a sort of ambassador personality who likes to compare and contrast.
Mhm.
But besides you, you're getting increasingly isolated. And so that is one of the things about the internet and the cultivation of consumer identity is that people will search out things to go real deep in, but the more those fragment, the more we have very few things tying us together beyond like the fact that we are consumers.
Mhm. I mean, yeah, that's a really good point. What like one of the things where I sort of went with that was just how yeah, that very much it sort of makes us like automatically self sort ourselves into these like subculture consumer groups in that like the sort of like mainstream is so inherently lacking that unless you're one of those just like I don't know, like people who's just like, yeah, no, like this is just like what I listen to whatever's on the radio, man. Like unless you're that type of weirdo, you're going to very much like in a way I'm kind of like glad that music is like this now, where it's so much freer than from like trying to appeal to the like mass media, like whatever's on to be played on the radio. But at the same time, that means that instead of artists trying to like push themselves into the mainstream, it's people are like trying to like auto sort themselves into a subculture, which is an inherently this sort of like consumerist thing. And this like I don't know, like you're like intentionally sort of pushing yourself into this like very narrow category, which because of like the nature of the internet and social media and all this stuff makes you a very recognizable, understandable group. I don't know if you've ever done it. There's a program that you could do, or I don't know if it's like a program or if it's just like a thing in Facebook, but you can look up exactly what Facebook thinks about you just based off of like the pages that you like or whatever, and it like has a shocking like very, and like it's not just like your politics, it'll be like, yeah, you're like probably like this smart because you like this show, but you also like this music, and like it's shocking and terrifying how like thoroughly and pretty effectively it sorts people based off of these things.
Well, it's amazing how so human beings on an individual basis are impossible to predict in a certain sense. In that, like the most predictable thing about the human is that they will surprise you, whether it's friends or someone you just met or family or whatever. But at the same time, human beings in populations are very easy to predict, and it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying because this is like, the gig economy is data, which is recording it's just the data is really just shorthand for recording human behavior. And the recording of human behavior, aka the commodification of surveillance society, is fundamentally about mining our behavior patterns, to sell to people who are getting better and better and better at running that through these evolving algorithms so that they can predict things. And the thing is like everyone's like, I'm not a statistic, and it's like, yeah, you're not, because you're an individual, but as an individual, you're a part of a population. And so it's like, for Hannah Arendt, the moments when you're truly human are those moments when you're not a statistic, but the rest of the day you're a statistic, right?
Yeah.
In Heideggerian terms, like you can only be authentic like for a little bit of the time ever. You know, most of the time you walk through a door like normal human beings walk through a door. You eat like people eat. You eat where people eat, and it's really like it's few and far between that you're doing something that's like truly breaking from the statistical norm. And then when you do break from the norm, then you're an outlier, and they don't fucking care about you, but you do help inform their analysis regardless.
Yeah.
Which is just like,
No, it's it's so scary. Also, sorry, I was just looking in the chat. River saying, "How's it possible that so many Canadian voices against socialized medicine keep growing?" Yeah, that is absolutely fucked. I shouldn't have been like, Canada's so great. Fucking Faith Goldie came in third for mayor in Toronto. And yeah, when I was just recently at like a protest against like I don't know if you know who Doug Ford is. Do you know who Rob Ford is, the crack smoking mayor of Toronto?
no.
Oh, our last mayor like smoked crack and was like doing just all this insane, super illegal stuff, like just horrible, was just like a absolute monster. There's clips where this is before he was elected mayor. He got elected mayor in not like this was not a problem. There's literally a video clip where he's talking about how they're trying to build a homeless shelter in his ward instead of a garbage dump. And he's like, you're saying that you want to have a homeless shelter there instead of a garbage dump? You know what you'll have is a homeless lynching. And like,
what the fuck? Okay, so you went to a protest for that, you're saying?
His brother is now premier of Ontario and just absolutely destroying our province.
Nepotism.
Yeah, he's like, there's been leaked plans that he's trying to socialize our healthcare. He's making just like absurd cuts. He's making cuts to he's making it so that like employers don't have to pay overtime as much anymore. Like just ridiculous, monstrous stuff.
Okay. So let's not call it the alt-right, the alternative influence network and the wannabe intellectual dark webbies and all that. I would say, isn't Canada like responsible for like, I don't know, so many
Stephen Molyneux,
like
Jordan Peterson, Faith Goldie, Rebel News,
Warren Southern.
Warren Southern, yeah. There's someone.
Who's the dude with the Proud Boys?
Gavin McInnes. Yeah, we've got a lot of them.
It's just like all of these people, like it's like from
Crowder,
over there.
Yeah.
You all, and Crowder too.
Yeah.
Say Shapiro, and I think we've got them all.
Yeah. It's wild. I mean, in fairness, I'm gonna say that Ted Cruz. But yeah, they do all emigrate to America, but I feel like it's because Ted Cruz is Canadian. Yeah,
I did not know that.
He's like it's something weird where he was like born in America but has Canadian citizenship because he grew up here and then moved back. That was one of the things that like Trump used against him in the election, where it would be probably, if Cruz got elected, the one positive thing from it would be that they would have to do a lawsuit and settle what citizenship means. But it would be like a way of contesting it. Or like whatever. But anyway, yeah, I feel like there's so much with like the way that Canadian show business is garbage. There's no show business in Canada. And so it's so funny how like anyone who stays in Canada just becomes like a dollar store knockoff of like the like good alt-right version in America. Warren Southern's been replaced on Rebel News, like the show that she was on, by like this other one who's like the same exact thing but a brunette. And yeah.
Dang, yeah. So, and now you might lose your socialized medicine. It's just basically it would there's two things. One is probably, I don't know, do y'all get AM radio? Have you been influenced or scarred in your society by United States AM radio?
I don't think in the same way, like, because we have like CBC is way bigger, like than like I guess your like NPR is. Like it's much more like in the UK what like BBC is.
You don't have people listening to Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck.
Not really. I don't like. I feel like it's like a more recent thing with like the internet disseminating that. But I mean, I'm sure that there is. We do have like the Sun, which is like our conservative rag, which wound up become Blaze TV, or no, not Blaze TV, Rebel Media. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I was gonna say that it just seems like neoliberalism hit Canada a little.
People are also telling me I'm wrong about the AM radio thing.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, you know, like you don't live in rural Alberta. It's probably popular there. And then there's the, you know, it affects mainly truck drivers and other kinds of working class commuters. But but it's in my own family, you know, it's very it's crazy because we live in a different day and age, but the people who are kind of nursed into this day and age on AM radio now listen to podcasts by Rush Limbaugh. So it's like those things have kind of come in, but this is the new gen that we're talking about. A lot of it's coming out of Canada, but like the whole losing, you know, a lot of your socialized medicine or more and more Canadian voices being against it. just speaks to like neoliberalism catching on there a little bit later, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And probably just the effects of neoliberal gutting of social programs is making people go, oh, this is garbage. Look at what we have. It's garbage. Well, yeah, it's
Yep.
fucking garbage. It's being gutted for who knows how long.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a huge part of it.
In the
Um,
meantime, I've got these teeth that need to get checked out, and I can't go to the dentist without having to like pay out of pocket because I
mhm.
don't have insurance. And it's like, yeah, fuck.
Same here for that. Yeah, our thing is that we cover basically a friend of mine. A friend of mine has a joke about it where we cover basically everything but your head. So everything but ears, teeth, eyes, and like your brain, like therapy.
Oh wow. And that brain therapy also, like that's something everybody needs nowadays. So
Yep.
the last thing I
Yeah.
would want to make sure, because I probably got to go to dinner soon, but
Yeah.
one oh, first of all, radio and mainstream radio is a weird thing. It's like the fact that it still exists. The hegemony of MTV, just as one example, got blown to pieces by MySpace.
Mhm.
So the 90s hegemony in the music industry by MTV was blown to pieces by the advent of MySpace. And which obviously didn't last forever, but it was enough to create the kind of boom and fragmentation in music that we have in alternative music, to the point where it's weird. Like there are radio artists still, but it's not like my dad knows who they are, or and I probably don't know who
Mhm.
they are, and you know what I mean, like it's weird. And that there are places, you know, at universities and hospitals and stuff like that that play radio music, but how do people get on there? Well, it's because of these old, really, you know, wealthy record labels that still have some power, but they don't have the kind of power they used to
Yeah.
before the internet. And so I don't know. I think that that's really interesting.
I agree. I mean, it reminds me of like I listen to a lot of like hip hop when like Chance the rapper and Run the Jewels, their thing, like they release all their like albums for free and then they just make all their money off touring, and Run the Jewels is like basically always on tour doing like every festival, and Chance the rapper was for a long time like touring a ton. And like I remember seeing so many people being like yeah, this is awesome, like this is like cool, like this is how like music works now. And like Chance like has like lines about how like I've only ever sold merch. And like in some ways it is kind of cool that it's like sort of freed from that from the grip of like record labels, but at the same time it's weird seeing so many people just like celebrating, oh yeah, artists have way fewer avenues to make money off of this. It is, oh, you have to be on the road every week. You know.
It's so frustrating too, because the punk and hardcore scene arose from basically dropouts who said, it doesn't matter, I'm not going anywhere fast. And so they would spend like a week in any town. Sometimes they'd stay longer than a week, depends on how the time in the town was going, and they'd be playing in people's basements and garages and stuff. And now if you have friends who play, like their life is like hectic as shit, and usually after a band makes it big, they're so sapped on their creative energy, the only thing they sing about is being on the road and being lonely. It's like
Yeah.
it's like immediately what comes to mind is A Day to Remember, because I just remember like there was like I just remember them back in the day, and like it was like there were like 10 bands all at once that I was listening to, and I realized all of them were singing about being on the road and and missing their hometown, but then going home and thinking everybody was a piece of shit, like sellout, and then going back on the road. It's just like that, and it's just like
Oh fuck. Yeah, no, yeah, it's, I mean, I feel like that's sort of to sort of bring it all full circle, like it's sort of kind of goes back to the way that what we were talking about earlier with like divisions of labor, about how now like a job, like what used to be like 10 different jobs is now one person, and how it's such a weird way that our culture has been sort of like tricked into seeing that as like amazing or awesome, and how, because in a sense that is kind of like, it is cool that I'm happy that I know how to do like some basic coding, and also like the Adobe Creative Suite, and also like I write jokes and book myself on shows, and also I'm like a good cook. But at the same time, that's not that the fact that I have to do all those things is not positive at all. And yeah, it's so nefarious how that how we sort of like get tricked by it into thinking, oh yeah, it's so cool that all of our favorite bands are going to be touring it all the time, or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and then it's not plausible the way the field is set up for them to be able to have a lot of time off to actually go back to, the creative task.
mm-hmm.
The last thing is just like, I'm really interested in kind of the conversation of postmodern Marxism, especially with like Marie Bookchin. We didn't talk about the other essay at all, the Communalist Project. Basically, if you read the Listen Marxist essay, it's an anarchist critique of Marxism, and I think it's one that, if you want to keep being a Marxist, maybe you should take some of those critiques seriously, because you can be something and still listen to critiques, right? But that he moves past anarchism for a variety of reasons, and he touches on those in the Communalist Project. One being that anarchism often just becomes a sort of consumer identity itself, and that it's very happy. Basically, like in its speech, it's revolutionary, but in its actions, it's like might as well be a neoliberal at the end of history, because there is no plausible way forward with expectations that are set so high. And for him, Bookchin sees. I think Bookchin's trying to think through a brand of populism that would be able to speak to people of every class, that would appeal to the idea that technology has gotten us to the point where we don't have to have an economic system built on scarcity, that we have the means at our disposal to redistribute abundance, to produce and redistribute abundance in a way where we could have a society that prioritizes things like community building and cultural consumption and stuff like that. And that I really like the idea of a movement away from the sort of rarefied, like revolutionary language and words of the 1900s, to one that is like developing new language that will appeal to and cut across different kinds of divisions, not just class, but also these kind of subcultural divisions that we talk about. And that two things that have cropped up on my radar that I haven't researched enough, but once I have, there will be videos to come about them, are post-capitalism and metamodernism. Are you familiar with either one?
No, not really.
Okay, so Post-Capitalism is a book by Paul Mason.
Oh, I've read a bit of that. Yeah, didn't finish.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and
Yeah.
he's not the only one who's like doing this kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that part of what they're doing is it's not fundamentally anti-capitalist. It's instead anybody who's doing it is trying to do it in a way that's like extremely strategic. Like, what is the most essential thing that needs to be changed that people could really get on board with? And I don't know enough about it yet, but I know that the spirit of the project is one that's interesting to me. Metamodernism, on the other hand, a lot of people know it more like in art or something, but it has its own political kind of program and that's being developed. And one of the main books in that movement is called The Listening Society, by a pseudonym Hanzi or something. I forget what, but it doesn't matter. The idea in a nutshell, which won't do it justice, obviously, is that postmodernism showed us that everything's a meta narrative, and that these meta narratives are largely arbitrary, and that so for instance, gender is arbitrary. Like the gender roles that get assigned are largely arbitrary.
Yeah.
But that you don't stop there, and metamodernism insists that you don't stop there. Instead, you say, okay, what are less destructive meta narratives that we could get behind? And so it's thinking forward in a way that says, yeah, it's all arbitrary to some degree, but like, what can people get on board with, and what are directions we could go that could give people a sense of purpose and meaning within their society, right? And I think that's an important project.
Yeah,
So.
no, I mean, I feel like that is really, I really like that, because that is, I guess, sort of like picking up where postmodernism sort of leaves off, where it's sort of, it sort of strikes me as maybe maybe this is me finally articulating what I was trying to talk about earlier, but I guess postmodernist sort of thinking is like, I guess all meta narratives are equally, because they're arbitrary. Let's just throw all of them in, the good with the bad, and sort of just let the cacophony of discontinuous meta narratives be what the meta narrative is. And I feel like that is sort of where the next move is to, I get, that's what the postmodernism, there needs to be a better word for it than that, direction is to sort of be like, make a return to I guess some sincerity, or some level of, no, like, let's actually come back to what could we say are the what is the sort of correct angle to go on, because it does a good job of breaking down everything, but if it doesn't, make room for something new from that wreckage, it's kind of, what use is it? So I'm definitely really interested in metamodernism. That sounds really cool.
Dan Pike, I would just, it recommends investigating nonviolent communication and critical pedagogy further. I've been a fan of critical pedagogy now for a couple of years. I've been reading into Ivan Illich and Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire and all of them. And I won't speak to it too much right now. I'll just say that nonviolent communication has been high on my radar. I'll actually be reading a book, the main book by Rosenberg on it, within the next couple of weeks. But that the thing about a universal project, one that would appeal to the humanity of humans everywhere, there's a critique of that there's all sorts of assumptions that get packaged into it, and then it becomes basically a move of empire.
I mean, that is the
entitlement and things like that, which is, I think that you can take that criticism and then still move forward. Everyone has limited time and energy. Everybody has people and things they care about beyond work. Those are universal statements that I just made. Did that make me a fucking colonizer? Well, whatever. Maybe insofar as language is colonizing, but whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing, is like, a lot of these discourses become defeatist or too cynical in their approach.
Absolutely.
And so, what does a positive universal metamodern sort of take on things look like? And it's like, we have no idea. And the one thing is, like, there's a lot of stuff about it that we can't articulate while we're in the midst of it. But like, that is the struggle of our generations, like this generation and other, every generation going forward. The part of our struggle will be developing that without ever knowing what it is, because we're trying to work on the engine while driving down the road while getting shot at. And the other problem is that it won't just be liberal-minded people that have to be talking. If conservatism is a mindset and not just a bunch of bullshit ideology, because we can separate those two things. If it's something that boils down to like neurochemistry and stuff like that as well, then these things have to be able to accommodate some of those basic emotions. The need for security security and the prioritization of it over openness as a basic division between liberalism and conservatism. Any sort of a project or a program that will work is going to have to be able to appeal to both.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it has to be like anti-choice, or whatever. But
yeah, no, but it has to be better than just being like, like, oh, you want to like lock the doors on, like you took this like personality test and you're have like a low degree of openness, then off to the re-education camps with you or whatever. I mean, it needs to be much more than about being like compatible with both of those.
Totally. I guess I would say my last statement on that, since we dunked on left book for a second, and keyboard warriorism and consumer identity of activist, language and stuff like that, is just to say that I think the most important thing is not whether you're left or right. It's that you are helping to normalize a society and ways of being that doesn't prioritize profit over people and the planet.
Yeah,
that's it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty, fair, and oh, that reminds me of something I wanted to. I forget, and this is already really long. I don't know. Should we sign off there?
We can go for another 2 hours on Yeah, I gotta go. I gotta go eat. So.
Yeah, same. Cool. This was really, really fun. I don't know if anyone's watching, we probably should have done this earlier because this is deep in now. But I'll obviously have like links to your channel and stuff. But you want to just like give a sign off, describe your channel or whatever?
Yeah. So, Theory Pleeb is just my. It's my YouTube channel. So I put up content that's available off of any podcasting app as well. I'd like to take the audio for this and add that to my podcast, for instance. And my stuff's kind of a mix right now. I'm still kind of like floundering around getting the feel for what I'm doing, but the general idea is that I'm trying to make concepts I've found really useful more accessible for people coming from a variety of standpoints. Like that's basically it. And I've got a few videos that are like, if you're going to go over to my channel, watch Game and watch Time Energy and then watch other stuff, but those are the two that are most important right now, probably. So yeah.
Your videos are really, really good. What's that?
I also have a blog.
Oh, nice.
I also have so see me on Medium, see me on your podcast, see me on I'm trying to like make a Goodreads presence. I decided that I should start doing Goodreads over Twitter and Facebook and things like that.
Oh my God, you're so prolific. Fuck. I feel so bad. I barely do Twitter in this.
Oh, shame, Sam. You work. You have it. Like I just graduated and I'm not working right now, so
that's fair.
I will probably have to work in the next like month or so, but right now I've still got loan money and I don't have to. So.
Ooh, yeah, enjoy it. Anyway, I'm gonna go eat and stuff. This is really fun to talk, and
Same. Yeah, look forward to doing something in the future. Take care.
Sweet. Sounds good. See ya.
All right, later. Bye, and bye everybody.
Bye.